Summer of 1876, the Texas Panhandle. A canyon cuts through the plains like a wound in the earth. Red walls rise 800 feet. Water moves through cottonwoods. Grass holds in the shelter. 1,600 longhorns, a small crew, a trail stretching back to Colorado. The place looks like sanctuary, yet beneath that promise, a calculation already runs. Capital from Denver, split on paper, interest accruing, wages set, profit divided, before a single fence post drives into ground. The canyon offers grass and water. The contract demands return. Expansion waits on borrowed money. Markets shift 6 states away. Who controls the land when the terms are written elsewhere? Was this a refuge, or just another extraction dressed in leather and dust? The story begins long before the cattle arrive. Chapter 1. The Canyon's Logic. Palo Duro. Canyon does not look like most of Texas. Stand on the rim and the world drops away. The prairie runs flat for miles, then suddenly falls. The canyon stretches roughly 120 miles, carving through Randall, Armstrong, Swisher, and Briscoe counties. The depth varies, but in places the walls climb 800 feet from the canyon floor. Layers of red sandstone, yellow caliche, white gypsum, all exposed by 1,000,000 years of water cutting downward. The prairie dog town fork of the Red River moves through the base. Slow most of the year. After storms, it runs brown and fast. Cottonwoods cluster along the water. Mesquite and juniper cling to the slopes. Grass grows thick where the canyon walls block wind and hold moisture. This is range that works year-round. The canyon offers what the open plains cannot: shelter from winter storms, reliable water, timber for corrals and structures. Natural barriers that make fencing easier. For cattle operations in the 1870s, these are not luxuries. They are survival tools. Understanding why the canyon was empty in 1876 requires stepping back to what came before. For generations, Comanche bands controlled the Texas Panhandle. They moved through the canyon seasonally. The walls provided shelter. The river offered water. Buffalo grazed the surrounding plains. This was not wilderness waiting to be claimed. It was contested ground, defended, used, and deeply known by people who had no interest in fences or permanent settlement. The Red River War of 1874 changed the arrangement. Federal forces under Ranald Mackenzie pursued Comanche bands into Palo Duro Canyon in late September. The engagement lasted hours, not days. Few fighters died in the direct fighting. But Mackenzie's soldiers destroyed the winter camps. They shot 1,400 ponies, removing the mobility that made Comanche resistance possible. By spring of 1875, most remaining bands had moved to reservations in Indian Territory. The canyon stood empty. Not naturally empty, but cleared. The timing was not accidental. Within months, ranchers from Colorado and New Mexico began scouting the Panhandle. They saw grass that had been lightly grazed. They saw water that flowed year-round. They saw opportunity that someone else's displacement had created. 120 miles of canyon, up to 800 feet down, a landscape carved for 1,000,000 years. And then the human timeline snaps tight. 1874, 1876. In June of 1876, 1,600 longhorns drop into the shelter. The land stays the same. The ownership story changes in 2 years. Charles Goodnight arrived in the canyon in June of 1876. He was 40 years old. He had spent 2 decades trailing cattle, fighting in the Texas Rangers during the Civil War, and losing money on ventures that started with promise and ended with debt. He understood range management. He knew how to read grass and water. He also understood that good land meant nothing without capital to hold it. The canyon impressed him immediately. He later described it as a natural fortress. The walls kept weather manageable. The grass stayed green longer than on the open plains. The cottonwoods provided timber for construction. He saw a foothold that could become an empire if someone else paid for the build-out. The question was, who? Chapter 2. The contract Goodnight met John George Adair in Denver sometime in early 1877. The meeting was arranged through mutual acquaintances in the cattle trade. Goodnight needed capital. Adair, an Irish financier with estates in Ireland and business interests across the American West, wanted exposure to the cattle industry. The match was pragmatic, not personal. Adair was 51 years old, wealthy, connected to British financial networks. Married to Cornelia Wadsworth Ritchie, a widow from an established New York family. Adair had invested in railroads, land speculation, and mining ventures. Cattle ranching represented another asset class, something he could fund at distance while Goodnight managed the operational details. The contract was signed in June of 1877. The terms were clear. Adair would hold a 2/3 interest in the partnership. Goodnight would hold 1/3, financed through a loan from Adair at 10% annual interest. Goodnight would receive a salary for managing the ranch. Profits, when they came, would be divided according to ownership shares. The salary was set at $2,500 annually, a substantial sum for the 1870s, enough to mark Goodnight as a professional manager rather than a common laborer. The wage secured his expertise. The debt secured his compliance. Together, they locked him into a structure where advancement meant paying down what he owed while building value that mostly belonged to someone else. The brand was simple. The initials of John and Adair's name combined. Some early records show the letters separate. Later versions connected them. The J.A. brand marked cattle, buildings, and eventually the identity of the operation itself. But the letters also marked who controlled the money. The partnership was structured to favor capital over labor. Adair's investment bought him majority ownership. Goodnight's knowledge, experience, and daily work bought him a minority stake and wages. It was a common arrangement in frontier cattle enterprises. It was also a structure that placed financial risk and ultimate control with the investor, not the operator. June of 1877, 2/3 on one side of the ledger, 1/3 on the other, financed, not gifted, 10% interest ticking in the background. $2,500 a year for the man making the calls in dust and weather. The empire starts as fractions and rates before it ever becomes cattle. By late 1877, the partnership held legal claim to land in and around Palo Duro Canyon. Goodnight moved cattle into the headquarters area, a flat section of the canyon floor with access to water and timber. The operation had a name, a brand, and capital behind it. The next step was building the infrastructure that would turn grass and water into profit. Chapter 3. Building the Apparatus. The headquarters complex grew steadily over the next several years. Stone came from the canyon walls. Timber came from the cottonwoods. Labor came from men hired locally and from drifters moving through the region looking for work. Wages were typical for the time and place, paid in cash, with some hands receiving credit arrangements. The headquarters itself expanded as the operation grew. By 1879, the focus shifted slightly from the original home ranch deeper in the canyon to a location closer to Turkey Creek, positioning the complex for better access to emerging rail lines and supply routes. Stone buildings rose in stages, the main house first, then the bunkhouse, storage sheds, a blacksmith shop with forge and anvil. Each structure served a specific function within the larger operational apparatus. Construction at scale requires counting in units most operations never reach. Stone, measured by the wagon load. Timber, counted in board feet running into the thousands. Nails ordered by the keg. Lime for mortar purchased in barrels. During peak building years, supply wagons made the trip from Amarillo weekly, sometimes more often. Each load cost money. Each delay cost time. The ledger tracked every nail, every pound of flour, every day of wages. At one point during the main house construction, more than 60 men worked the site simultaneously. 60 daily wages, dozens of meals, dozens of reasons the cost kept climbing. The main house was built of native stone, thick walls to hold heat in winter and stay cool in summer. A long, low structure that fit the canyon floor without trying to dominate it. Separate buildings handled specific functions. A bunkhouse for the crew, a cookhouse for meals, storage sheds for equipment and supplies, a blacksmith shop for repairs, corrals built from split cottonwood logs. The architecture was utilitarian. No ornament, no wasted space. Every building served a purpose. The goal was efficiency, not display. Goodnight understood that dollars spent on decoration were dollars not returned in cattle sales. Water infrastructure came next. The canyon had the river, but ranching at scale required more. Wells were dug. Windmills were erected to pump water into stock tanks. Pipelines, crude by later standards, moved water to areas farther from the river. This was not a single project. It was ongoing work that demanded constant maintenance and expansion as the herd grew. Fencing followed. In the 1870s, the Texas Panhandle was still open range. Cattle roamed freely, identified by brand at roundup time. But open range meant risk. Cattle could drift in storms. Neighboring operations could push onto your grass. Water access could be blocked by others. Goodnight began fencing key areas as soon as barbed wire became widely available. The fences were not boundaries around the entire operation, not yet. They were tools to control movement, protect water, and manage grazing patterns. By 1882, the operation had strung its first major drift fence, a barrier designed to stop cattle from drifting south during winter storms. The fence ran for miles, barbed wire on cedar posts, a statement that the open range was closing. Other ranchers watched. Some followed the example. Others resented the enclosure. The fence worked. It also required maintenance. Wire broke in cold snaps, posts rotted, gates needed hinges replaced. Each repair added to the list of tasks that never ended. Mark the speed of it. 1876, a foothold. 1877, a contract. 1882, wire on posts, a drift fence that turns weather into a boundary dispute. Less than 10 years from Canyon Camp to a ranch measured in the millions of acres. One season at a time, one bill at a time, one more mile that has to hold. The labor force varied by season. During peak times, spring and fall roundups, branding, trail drives, the ranch employed dozens of men. Cooks, wranglers, cowboys, carpenters, blacksmiths, teamsters. During winter, the crew shrank to a core group who maintained the headquarters and tended cattle in the canyon. Housing for workers was basic. Bunkhouses with rows of narrow beds, communal meals in the cookhouse, long days that started before dawn and ended after dusk. Injuries were common: falls from horses, rope burns, broken bones from handling cattle. Medical care was limited. Serious injuries meant a long, rough ride to the nearest town. Pay came weekly or monthly, depending on the arrangement. Some men worked for wages alone. Others took part of their pay in cattle, a share of the calf crop that allowed them to start their own small herds. This was not generosity. It was a way to retain experienced workers without raising cash outlays. Goodnight enforced strict rules: no gambling, no whiskey, no fighting. Violations meant dismissal, sometimes immediate. The rules created a reputation. The JA was known as a dry camp, orderly, predictable. Some men appreciated the stability. Others chafed under the control and moved on. The headquarters grew into a small, self-contained community. By the early 1880s, it included not just workers, but families. A school opened in 1891 to serve the children of employees and nearby settlers. The building was modest, a single room with benches and a wood stove. Teachers came and went, but the existence of the school signaled something shifting. This was no longer a temporary camp. It was becoming infrastructure, meant to last. Chapter 4. The Peak. By the mid-1880s, the JA Ranch had reached a scale that dwarfed most cattle operations in Texas. The numbers tell part of the story. The rest lives in what those numbers required to function. The scale of daily operations defied easy summary. 1,325,000 acres under management. 100,000 cattle requiring seasonal movement, water access, and protection from weather and predators. Line camps scattered across the range, each needing supplies hauled by wagon every month. A large remuda at headquarters alone. Thousands of fence posts driven into hard ground. Miles of wire strung and maintained. And beneath all of it, the constant flow of money out. Wages every week, coal every month. Equipment repairs that never stopped. Start with land. The operation controlled roughly 1,325,000 acres. Not all of it was owned outright. Some parcels were leased. Others were public grazing land used under informal agreements that predated formal regulation. The footprint stretched across multiple counties: Armstrong, Donley, Briscoe, Hall, Swisher. It was an empire built on grass and water, held together by fences, contracts, and the willingness to defend boundaries when neighbors pushed. Cattle numbered around 100,000 head at the peak. Longhorns, crossbred with Hereford bulls that Goodnight brought in to improve beef quality. The herd required constant management. Seasonal roundups to brand calves, identify strays, and cut out cattle ready for market. Trail drives to railheads in Kansas or Colorado. Winter feeding when snow covered the grass. Veterinary care, basic by modern standards, but still expensive when applied across tens of thousands of animals. The headquarters complex had grown. Multiple stone buildings, expanded corrals, a network of line camps, small outposts scattered across the range where cowboys lived for weeks at a time, watching for predators, checking water, and moving cattle as grass wore thin in one area and recovered in another. The operation drew on scores of people during busy seasons: cowboys, cooks, blacksmiths, teamsters, carpenters. Farther from the headquarters, line camps housed smaller crews who worked in isolation for months. They lived in crude shelters, 1 or 2 room structures with dirt floors and leaking roofs. Supplies came by wagon every few weeks. Mail arrived irregularly. The work was hard, repetitive, and lonely. Profit came from cattle sales. Steers were trailed north to Kansas railheads, where buyers from Chicago packing houses paid cash or credit. Prices fluctuated with national markets, weather, and competition. A good year meant solid returns. A bad year meant barely breaking even after expenses. Expenses ran high, feed costs during hard winters, lost cattle to weather, predators, and theft, wages for a large crew, maintenance on buildings, fences, and equipment, costs for shipping cattle to market, interest payments on Goodnight's loan from Adair. The operation generated revenue, but it also consumed capital at a pace that required constant attention. The scale was impressive. The fragility was real. One severe winter could kill thousands of cattle. A market crash could wipe out a year's profit. A legal challenge to land claims could force contraction. The empire ran on momentum, expansion justified by the belief that bigger meant safer. But bigger also meant more vulnerable to forces beyond anyone's control. From the outside, the JA looked like success. Visitors saw a sprawling operation, orderly camps, branded cattle grazing across miles of grass. What they did not see was the ledger, income and expenses balanced on a knife edge, growth financed by debt. Profit split according to a contract that gave the majority to someone who never lived in the canyon, never rode the range, and never felt the cold of a panhandle winter. Chapter 5. The Daily Grind. Understanding the operation requires looking past the numbers to the routines that sustained them. The day started before dawn. Cowboys rolled out of bunks in the cold. Breakfast was basic. Biscuits, bacon, coffee strong enough to strip rust. No time for conversation. Eat fast. Saddle your horse. Ride out while the light was still gray. Morning work varied by season. In spring, branding calves. In summer, checking water sources and moving cattle to fresh grass. In fall, gathering strays and sorting cattle for market. In winter, breaking ice on stock tanks and searching for cattle that had drifted in storms. Midday brought a brief pause. Noon meal, if you were close enough to the headquarters or a line camp. More often, you ate cold biscuits from your saddlebag and kept working. The sun in summer could push above 100 degrees. In winter, wind cut through layers of clothing. Comfort was not part of the job description. Afternoon meant finishing whatever task the morning had started. Repairing fences, doctoring sick cattle, hauling supplies to distant camps, riding the boundary to check for trespassers. The work was physical, repetitive, and often dangerous. Cattle were unpredictable, horses threw riders, weather turned without warning. Evening brought return to the headquarters or camp. Unsaddle your horse, check its hooves and legs for injuries, eat whatever the cook prepared. Wash dust off your face and hands. Sit by a fire if the weather allowed. Talk about the day, tomorrow's plan, gossip from other outfits. Fall into your bunk. Sleep hard. Wake before dawn and repeat. Hierarchy was clear. Goodnight sat at the top. His word was final on all decisions. Beneath him, a ranch foreman who managed day-to-day operations and supervised the crew. Beneath the foreman, lead cowboys who handled specific tasks, roundup boss, trail boss, cook. Everyone else fell below that, ranked by skill, experience, and Goodnight's favor. Advancement was possible, but rare. A good hand might rise to lead a roundup crew. A man who proved reliable might run a line camp. But most cowboys stayed at the bottom. Wages were steady, but there was no path to ownership, no profit sharing, no retirement. You worked as long as your body held. When it gave out, you moved on or found other work. Women were mostly absent from the operation itself. Wives of married employees lived at the headquarters or nearby. They cooked, cleaned, raised children, and managed small gardens. Some helped with bookkeeping or provisioning. But the work of the ranch, the cattle, the fences, the daily labor, was entirely male. School that opened in 1891 served children of employees and nearby settlers. One room, one teacher, usually a young woman, hired from outside the region. Classes ran sporadically, dependent on weather and the teacher's willingness to stay in an isolated, demanding environment. Few teachers lasted more than a year. Life at the JA was stable compared to many frontier operations. Goodnight's rules kept the worst excesses in check, but stability did not mean comfort. It meant predictable discomfort. Long hours, low pay, minimal medical care, and no guarantee the work would still be there next season. Operation asked everything from its workers. It gave back wages, meals, and a place to sleep. For some men, that was enough. For others, it was a stepping stone to something else. And for a few, it was a dead end they could not escape. Chapter 6. The Hidden Ledger. The JA looked like success from the outside. Cattle spread across multiple counties, headquarters buildings that signaled permanence, a reputation that drew buyers and investors. But behind the visible operation, costs accumulated in ways that Goodnight could manage but never eliminate. January of 1887 brought the squeeze into focus. An invoice arrived from the coal supplier. The price had jumped again. No explanation, no negotiation. Winter demand exceeded supply, and suppliers' new ranches had no choice but to pay. That same week, a windmill at one of the Eastern Line camps seized. The repair required parts shipped by rail, then hauled the last miles by wagon. It took weeks of work and real money in parts and labor. While the windmill sat broken, cattle had to be moved to other water, shifting grazing patterns and creating crowding that increased disease risk. Two problems, both unexpected, both expensive, both unavoidable. This was not crisis. This was February. Start with coal. The headquarters buildings required heating through panhandle winters. Coal came by wagon from distant suppliers, enough to keep stoves burning through the winter. The expense grew every time temperatures dropped. January of 1887 is a good month to understand scale. Not because the ranch is big, because the bills are frequent. 10% interest, $2,500 a year in salary. 1/3 of the upside, on paper. Coal ordered again. Repairs ordered again. Money comes in when cattle sell. Money goes out every week. That gap is where empires thin. Wages consumed a significant portion of revenue. A large seasonal workforce, even at modest pay, meant money leaving the account every month. Goodnight paid competitive rates for the region, but competitive meant just enough to keep men from walking away to a neighboring outfit. Maintenance never stopped. Fences broke in storms. Windmills needed repairs. Buildings developed leaks. Corrals rotted and had to be rebuilt. Equipment wore out. Horses went lame. Wagons broke axles. Every repair cost money, and the costs were constant. Weather brought losses that could not be predicted or prevented. A hard winter in 1886 killed cattle across the Great Plains. Estimates vary, but in the Panhandle, some losses were said to run as high as 75%, especially along drift fences. The JA suffered losses, though Goodnight's use of the canyon for shelter reduced the damage compared to ranches on open range. Still, dead cattle meant lost revenue and no way to recover the investment already made in their care. Predators took a steady toll. Wolves, coyotes, mountain lions. Cowboys shot them when they could. Predator control was constant work, but predators adapted. They learned to avoid riders and strike at night. The losses were small in percentage terms, but significant in aggregate over years. Theft was a persistent problem. Cattle rustling was common across the frontier. Brands could be altered. Strays could be claimed by others. The JA employed line riders specifically to patrol boundaries and watch for missing cattle. But manpower was limited, and thieves were patient. Interest on Goodnight's loan from Adair compounded annually. 10% on a large sum meant thousands of dollars owed before profit could be calculated. The debt structured the partnership in a way that ensured Adair's capital was protected. Goodnight's labor, no matter how skilled, was secondary to the return on investment. Market prices for cattle fluctuated based on national economic conditions. A recession in the East meant lower demand for beef. Lower demand meant lower prices. Lower prices meant tighter margins. The JA had no control over these forces, but it felt every shift. Taxes and legal fees added smaller but steady expenses. Land ownership required paying county taxes. Disputes over boundaries or water rights required lawyers. Goodnight was reportedly careful about legal matters, but caution cost money. Transportation costs for getting cattle to market cut into profit. Trail drives required wages for drovers, food for the crew, and time during which cattle lost weight. Shipping by rail, when it became available, meant paying freight charges that varied by distance and route. The operation generated income, sometimes substantial income. But income and profit are different calculations. After subtracting wages, coal, maintenance, interest, losses, and transportation, the margin that remained was narrower than the scale of the enterprise suggested. This was not a money-printing operation. It was a business that demanded constant capital infusions to keep functioning. Goodnight managed the details. He kept ledgers. He negotiated with suppliers. He made decisions about when to sell, when to hold, when to expand, when to contract. But the fundamental structure, capital controlled by Adair, debt carried by Goodnight, limited how much control he actually had over the future. The question that hovered over every decision was simple. How long could this pace be sustained? Growth required borrowing. Borrowing required profit to service debt. Profit required favorable markets, good weather, and luck. When any of those faltered, the entire structure became precarious. Chapter 7. Who Profits? The partnership between Goodnight and Adair was built on clear terms, but clarity did not mean fairness in any moral sense. It meant each man knew what he would receive and what he risked. Adair provided capital. His 2/3 ownership stake meant he collected the majority of profits when the operation made money. He lived in Ireland and New York, far from the panhandle. He visited the ranch occasionally, brief trips to inspect the property and meet with Goodnight. The visits were ceremonial more than operational. Adair did not manage cattle. He managed investments. Goodnight provided expertise, labor, and daily decision-making. His 1/3 stake meant he earned less than Adair from the same cattle sales. His salary compensated for management work, but salaries do not build wealth the way ownership does. Goodnight was well paid compared to his employees, but he was not accumulating capital at the rate Adair was. The loan structure tilted the arrangement further. Goodnight owed Adair money from the start, borrowed to finance his ownership share. The 10% interest meant Goodnight paid Adair for the privilege of working as a minority partner. In good years, the profit covered the debt service. In bad years, the debt grew. This arrangement was common in frontier enterprises. Investors in distant cities funded operations run by men with local knowledge. The investor risked capital. The operator risked time, labor, and often personal safety. Both hoped for profit, but the structure ensured the investor held control. When Adair died in 1885, ownership passed to his wife, Cornelia. she maintained the partnership structure. She continued to visit the ranch periodically, more frequently than her husband had. She was reportedly interested in the operations and formed a respectful working relationship with Goodnight. But the financial terms did not change. She held 2/3. Goodnight held 1/3. The profits flowed accordingly. The ranch passed through the Ritchie line, descendants who would maintain the Adair name and the operation for generations. The operation remained in the Adair-Ritchie line. The descendants of John and Cornelia would control the majority share for generations long after Goodnight's involvement ended. Below Goodnight and the Adair-Ritchie family, no one else had ownership. Cowboys worked for wages. Cooks, carpenters, blacksmiths, all worked for wages. Some hands received cattle as part of their pay, but these were animals they owned individually, not shares in the operation itself. There was no path from laborer to partner. The hierarchy was fixed. The power structure extended beyond the ranch itself. Goodnight's decisions about land use, water rights, and grazing patterns affected neighboring ranchers and settlers. Some saw the JA as a stabilizing force, a well-managed operation that set standards for others. Others saw it as an enclosure, a private claim on resources that had previously been open to all. Local governments had limited ability to regulate large ranches. County officials were often ranchers themselves, or economically dependent on ranchers. The JA's size gave it influence over local politics, water access, and road development. Goodnight reportedly used that influence carefully, avoiding open conflict when possible. But influence exists whether it is used overtly or held in reserve. Understanding who profited from the JA requires looking past the cattle to the capital structure beneath. The animals were the product. The land was the factory. The workers were the labor force. But the profits accumulated in places far from the canyon, in bank accounts in New York and Ireland, with people who never felt dust in their teeth or cold in their bones. Goodnight was successful by most measures. He earned a good living. He gained a reputation. He built systems that worked. But he did not control the apparatus he had built. That control belonged to others, and the terms were written before the first cow entered the canyon. Chapter 8. The Closing Frontier. By the late 1880s, forces beyond the canyon were reshaping the economics and politics of ranching in Texas. Railroads reached the panhandle. The first rails arrived in 1887, connecting Amarillo to national networks. Suddenly, cattle no longer had to be trailed hundreds of miles to Kansas. They could be shipped directly from local stations. This cut transportation time and weight loss. It also cut the need for large trail crews. The change was efficient. It was also destabilizing. Operations that had relied on trail driving contracts found those contracts evaporating. Towns that had grown as trail stops withered. Beef prices dropped through the late 80s and early 90s. Overproduction, national economic downturns, and increased competition from other regions all pushed prices lower. The JA still sold cattle, but margins tightened. Years that would have been profitable at 1880, prices barely broke even at 1890 prices. Settlement pressure increased. The federal government opened panhandle lands to homesteading. Farmers moved in, fencing small parcels, planting crops, and claiming water rights. The open range that ranchers had used informally without legal ownership began to close. Ranchers that had grazed public land for free now faced either buying that land or losing access. Political winds shifted. In Texas and nationally, anger toward large landholders grew. Populist movements argued that cattle barons monopolized resources, blocked settlement, and exercised too much political power. Legislation began restricting how much public land a single entity could use. Enforcement was inconsistent, but the direction was clear. The era of informal control over vast territories was ending. Goodnight felt the pressure. His approach had always been expansion. Acquire more land, run more cattle, spread risk across a larger footprint. But expansion required capital, and Adair's estate, now managed by Cornelia, was less willing to fund further growth. The partnership had been profitable in its early years. By the late 80s, profitability was uncertain, and investors do not fund uncertainty indefinitely. Goodnight also faced personal frustrations. He had built the operation from open ground. He had made decisions, managed men, and created systems that worked, but he did not control the majority share. He reported to Cornelia, and while their relationship was reportedly cordial, the structure meant his authority was limited. He could recommend, he could argue, but he could not override an owner who held twice his stake. Tensions over land sales reportedly contributed to the eventual break. Cornelia wanted to sell portions of the ranch to reduce costs and secure liquid capital. Goodnight believed selling land weakened the long-term position. Both views had logic. Both reflected different priorities. Owners wanted financial security. Operators wanted operational flexibility. By the early 1890s, Goodnight's exit was becoming likely. The partnership that had started with ambition and optimism now ran on habit and compromise. Neither side was satisfied. Neither side saw a path forward that met their needs. By the early 1890s, Goodnight severed his formal connection to the J.A. Ranch. The exact terms are not fully documented, but he left with enough capital to start a smaller operation near the village that would later bear his name. He took his knowledge, his reputation, and his frustrations. He did not take ownership of the land he had made productive or the systems he had built. The J.A. continued without him. Cornelia and the Ritchie family hired managers to oversee operations. The ranch contracted, selling parcels to cover costs and adjust to the new economic reality. But it did not collapse. It adapted. Goodnight's departure raises questions that depend on perspective. Was he a visionary pushed out by cautious capital, or a manager who overextended and lost the confidence of his investors? Was the split inevitable given the partnership structure, or could better communication have preserved the arrangement? The answers are not settled. What is clear is that the man who conceived the operation, who moved the first cattle into the canyon, and who built the infrastructure that made the J.A. possible, left with a fraction of the value he had created. The land, the brand, the systems, all stayed with the owners. The labor, no matter how skilled, remained subordinate to capital. Chapter 9. The Long Adjustment. After Goodnight's departure, the J.A. Ranch entered a slower, less dramatic phase. No more rapid expansion, no more grand visions. The focus shifted to sustainability and efficiency. Cornelia Adair managed the operation from a distance, relying on hired managers to handle daily decisions. The ranch continued as a cattle operation, but its footprint shrank. Land sales through the 1890s and early 1900s reduced the total acreage. Some parcels were sold to settlers, others went to neighboring ranches. The reduction was gradual, not a sudden collapse, a controlled contraction designed to match expenses to revenue in a harsher economic climate. The numbers tell part of the story. At peak, the J.A. spread to 1,325,000 acres, with roughly 100,000 head of cattle. Over the following decades, the footprint shrank. By 1945, the ranch was down to about 335,000 acres. The herd fell with it. The operation remained large by most standards, but it was no longer an empire. Labor needs decreased as the operation shrank. Fewer cattle meant fewer cowboys. Line camps closed. Seasonal crews became smaller. The headquarters remained active, but the sprawling network of outposts and riders that had characterized the peak years faded. Technology changed the work. Windmills became more reliable, fencing improved, trucks began replacing wagons for hauling supplies, though this transition took decades. The fundamental work, managing cattle on grass, remained the same, but the tools and pace shifted toward mechanization and efficiency. Cornelia died in 1921. Control passed to her son, Montague Ritchie, Jr., and the Ritchie line that followed. The ranch incorporated in the late 1940s as the J.A. Cattle Company, formalizing its structure and ownership. Incorporation brought legal clarity and tax advantages. It also signaled a shift from personal ownership to institutional continuity. The ranch was no longer the project of a specific individual, it was a family asset managed across generations. The Great Depression hit hard. Beef prices dropped. Operating costs remained high. Many smaller ranches failed. The J.A. survived in part because of its size, in part because the Ritchie family had diversified assets and could weather lean years. But survived came at a cost. More land sold, more expenses cut. The operation shrank further. World War II brought temporary relief. Demand for beef surged. Prices rose. The J.A., like many ranches, expanded production during the war years. But the post-war period brought new challenges. Labor costs increased. Government regulation expanded. Competition intensified. Through all these changes, the operation maintained a core identity. It remained a working cattle ranch. It remained under control of the Adair Ritchie descendants, and it remained tied to the same canyon where Goodnight had driven his first cattle nearly a century earlier. The story popular histories tell emphasizes continuity, family stewardship, and tradition. That story is partially true. The ranch did survive. The family did maintain control. But continuity is not the same as stasis. Every generation made compromises. Every decade required adjustments. The operation that existed in the 1950s bore little resemblance to the 1880s empire. Same name, same brand, different reality. Chapter 10. Modern Operations. Today, the J.A. Ranch continues as a working cattle operation. The scale is smaller than its peak, but the work is recognizable to anyone who understands ranching. The operation describes itself as cow-calf with yearlings. This means the ranch maintains a breeding herd that produces calves annually. Calves are raised to yearling age, roughly 12 to 18 months, then sold or moved to different grazing. The model prioritizes steady production over speculative growth. Modern ranching runs on different mathematics, but equally tight margins. The breeding herd, predominantly Angus cows, still numbers in the thousands. Stocking rates flex with rainfall and grass productivity. The Colorado ranch handles yearlings during the summer months, then they return in the fall. Moving cattle that far costs fuel, truck maintenance, and labor, expenses that don't care what the market does. Veterinary programs and emergency care add more. Property taxes and insurance keep climbing, and beef prices remain volatile, swinging year to year based on forces entirely outside the ranch's control. The breeding strategy focuses on crossbreeding. The ranch uses predominantly Angus cows crossed with Charolais bulls. Angus provides maternal traits, calving ease, and marbling in the beef. Charolais adds size and lean muscle. The cross produces cattle that balance market demands for quality and quantity. A small program maintains first-generation crosses. first-generation hybrids used as replacement heifers to refresh the breeding herd. The operation spans 2 states. The Texas base remains in the Panhandle, centered on the original headquarters site and surrounding lands. A Colorado property provides summer grazing for yearlings. The seasonal movement is logistically complex, but economically rational. Texas provides winter shelter and calving grounds. Colorado provides cooler summer grazing that allows yearlings to gain weight efficiently during the hottest months. The headquarters complex is now a National Historic Landmark, designated in 1960. Several original buildings remain, including structures from Goodnight's era. The designation recognizes the site's historical significance. It also brings restrictions. Alterations to historic buildings require approval. Preservation becomes an added cost layered onto operational needs. Employment has changed. Fewer full-time cowboys, more seasonal hires, increased reliance on contractors for specialized work, veterinary care, fence building, equipment repair. The bunkhouse model has largely disappeared, replaced by workers who live off-site and commute. The transformation reflects broader changes in rural labor markets and ranching economics. Technology has altered daily work. GPS tracking for cattle in some areas, improved veterinary tools, better fencing materials. Trucks and trailers replace horses for many tasks, yet the core work remains physical. Branding, calving, moving cattle, checking water, fixing what breaks. The tools have improved, but the labor is still labor. The ranch remains under control of descendants of Cornelia Adair. Exact ownership structure is not publicly detailed, but the ranch's own materials emphasize continuity across generations. This is presented as stewardship, a family commitment to maintaining a working operation rather than selling to developers or industrial agriculture interests. Profit margins in modern ranching are notoriously thin. Operating costs, land taxes, insurance, fuel, feed, veterinary care, wages, equipment, all these expenses rise steadily. Beef prices fluctuate based on national and global markets. Weather remains unpredictable. Drought years cut grass production and force expensive supplemental feeding or early sales. Wet years bring their own problems, mud, disease, and logistical headaches. The operation survives not because ranching is lucrative, but because the land has been held long enough that it is not burdened by recent debt. Legacy ownership allows the ranch to weather lean years that would break newer operations. This is an advantage built on time, not skill. The value is not in annual profit, but in the land itself, held across generations, appreciating slowly while the work continues. The modern JA is not the empire of the 1880s. It is a working ranch that carries a historical name. It produces cattle, it employs people, it occupies land, and it exists in a tension between operational necessity and historical identity. Visitors see the landmark. Workers see the fences. Both are true. Neither tells the whole story. Chapter 11. Fire as Pressure. Fire is not a crisis on the Texas Panhandle. It is a constant. The grasslands evolved with fire. Lightning strikes started burns long before humans arrived. Grass regrows quickly after fire, often more vigorously than before. Fire clears dead vegetation, returns nutrients to soil, and controls woody plants that would otherwise dominate the range. This is an ecosystem fact, understood by land managers and university researchers alike. Ranches use fire intentionally. Prescribed burns, controlled fires set under specific weather conditions, are management tools. They clear brush, improve forage quality, and reduce fuel loads that could feed larger-scale wildfires. The JA Ranch participates in the Texas Panhandle Prescribed Burn Association, a coalition of ranchers and land managers who coordinate burns and share equipment. The association's stated mission emphasizes habitat management, wildfire prevention, and rangeland health. This is sensible land stewardship. It is also economic self-interest. Healthy grass means better cattle gains. Reduced wildfire risk means lower insurance costs and less property damage. The goals align. But fire does not always cooperate with management plans. May 2018. Conditions were extreme: high temperatures, low humidity, and dry grass primed to run. The Mallard Fire ignited on May 8th and burned more than 75,000 acres before it was contained on May 29th. The exact cause remains undetermined. What followed mattered more than how it started. The fire spread rapidly. Within hours, it had consumed thousands of acres. Within days, the total exceeded 75,000 acres. Containment efforts involved multiple fire departments, state resources, and ranchers working to protect structures and livestock. The fire burned until late May, nearly 3 weeks of active containment work. The National Weather Service in Amarillo documented unusual fire behavior. The heat and intensity of the burn created its own weather, a pyrocumulonimbus cloud that generated lightning and downdrafts. This is rare, but not unheard of in extreme wildfire conditions. The fire essentially became self-sustaining, feeding on grass and creating winds that pushed it farther. The damage was significant. Fences burned, pastures were blackened, cattle had to be moved quickly to avoid loss. Some animals were injured or killed. The economic cost included lost grazing, fence replacement, supplemental feed to replace burned pasture, and labor to manage the aftermath. From May 8th to May 29th. 3 weeks where the calendar stops working and only the wind matters. More than 75,000 acres burned, grass you can regrow, fence you have to buy. A ranch this old can survive one fire. It cannot afford the same lesson every 10 years. For the JA, the fire was not existential, but it was disruptive. Operations had to adapt. Grazing plans shifted. Expenses increased. Recovery would take seasons, not weeks. Grass regrows, but fences do not rebuild themselves, and the lost productivity in burned pastures affects income for months. Fire also raised questions about vulnerability. Climate projections suggest the Panhandle will experience more extreme heat and drought in coming decades. More heat and less moisture mean more fire risk. Prescribed burns reduce that risk, but do not eliminate it. And large-scale wildfires, once contained, leave operations scrambling to recover. The fire is both a specific event and a metaphor. It represents forces that cannot be fully controlled, only managed and adapted to. It represents costs that arrive suddenly and demand immediate response, and it represents the reality that working a landscape means accepting the landscape's terms, even when those terms are harsh. Chapter 12. The Horse. Thread. Cattle built the JA, but horses carry a different kind of legacy. The ranch began breeding quarter horses in the 1930s. The exact start date is not precisely documented, but the operation's own accounts place the program in this era. Quarter horses, developed in the American Southwest, are compact, muscular horses bred for sprinting short distances, quick turns, and cattle work. They fit the needs of working ranches perfectly. The JA's program focused on producing working horses, not show animals. The goal was horses that could handle long days, rough terrain, and the demands of moving cattle. Bloodlines were selected for temperament, durability, and performance, not for ribbons or registration premiums. In 1997, the American Quarter Horse Association honored the ranch and Montague Ritchie, a descendant of Cornelia Adair, with a legacy award. The award recognizes long-term contributions to the breed and the industry. For the JA, it formalized what had been true for decades. The ranch was not just a cattle operation, but a breeding ground for the horses that made cattle work possible. 1930s, a breeding program begins. 1997, a legacy award makes it official. Two dates, 60 years apart, saying the same thing. Ranching isn't only land and cattle, it's continuity measured in decades. The horse program continues today. The scale is smaller than in mid-century, when ranches relied almost entirely on horses for daily work. Modern ranching uses trucks, trailers, and ATVs for many tasks horses once performed, but horses remain essential for certain work. Rough terrain, sorting cattle in tight spaces, moving animals through areas vehicles cannot reach. The horses also carry symbolic weight. They connect the modern operation to the early days when every task required a horse. They represent continuity, tradition, and a commitment to methods that modern efficiency has not entirely replaced. Whether this is romanticism or practicality depends on who you ask. For the ranch, it is both. Chapter 13. Conservation as Narrative. The JA Ranch participates in conservation programs. The framing varies depending on the source, but several threads are consistent. The Colorado property, used for summer grazing, is tied to a conservation easement. The easement, managed through the Colorado Cattleman's Agricultural Land Trust, restricts future development in exchange for tax benefits and recognition. The arrangement allows the ranch to maintain working operations while protecting the land from subdivision or sale to developers. Easements like this are common tools in modern land conservation. They serve multiple goals. Landowners receive tax advantages. Conservation organizations secure long-term protection for open space and wildlife habitat. The land remains in productive use, but future uses are constrained. The JA also donated bison to Texas Parks and Wildlife Department in 1996. The donation is documented in a conservation report on North American bison. The gift connected the ranch to a broader effort to preserve bison genetics and support public herds. It also connected the ranch to a popular narrative about Goodnight and bison preservation. The story, often repeated, claims that Charles Goodnight allowed bison hunting to clear land for cattle, but later preserved a small herd at the urging of his wife, Mary Ann. Variations of the story appear in interpretive materials and popular histories. The core claim that Goodnight maintained bison and contributed to their survival has some support. The details are murkier. Goodnight did reportedly keep a small bison herd. Whether this was preservation or curiosity is harder to determine. Ranchers in the late 19th century sometimes kept exotic animals as novelties. Buffalo were economically worthless by the 1890s, but they were culturally significant. Keeping a few could serve as a living exhibit, a way to claim connection to the vanished frontier. The 1996 donation is more straightforward. The ranch transferred bison to Texas Parks and Wildlife Department for herd management purposes. The animals went into public herds, maintained by the state for conservation and education. This is documented. It is also presented by the ranch and conservation groups as evidence of long-term stewardship. The conservation framing is not false, but it is selective. Easements protect land from development, yes. They also provide tax benefits that reduce operating costs. Bison donations support conservation, yes. They also create positive publicity and align the ranch with popular environmental values. Both motives can coexist. Both are real. Put the dates in one line and the story changes shape. 1874, the canyon is cleared by force. 1876, cattle arrive. 1877, money arrives. 1996, bison leave the ranch again, this time as a donation. 2013, a public ranking lists 158,500 acres. May of 2018, fire reminds everyone that ownership is not the same thing as control. What the conservation narrative tends to obscure is the foundation the ranch was built on. Land cleared of Comanche presence, buffalo herds eliminated to make room for cattle, open range enclosed by fences, resources concentrated in private hands. The modern conservation story presents the ranch as a protector of open space and wildlife. The historical record shows a more complicated pattern of displacement, extraction, and consolidation. Both stories are true. The ranch does participate in conservation programs. The ranch also exists because earlier generations cleared and enclosed land for private profit. Presenting one without the other is not lying, but it is incomplete. Chapter 14, The Acreage Puzzle. Determining the current size of the JA Ranch is harder than it should be. A 2013 landowner ranking listed JA Ranch heirs at 158,500 acres. The figure appeared in multiple publications, including The Land Report and Modern Farmer. Both sources are secondary, compiling data from surveys and public records. The number is specific enough to suggest research, but neither source explains how they calculated the total or whether it includes leased land. A Texas Tech University bibliography on ranching references the JA at over 335,000 acres. This figure appears in a compiled list without citation details. The number is substantially higher than the 2013 figure. The discrepancy could reflect different time periods, different accounting methods for owned versus leased land, or simple error. The ranch's own materials do not provide a current acreage total. Descriptions emphasize the operation's history and scope, but avoid specific numbers. This is not unusual. Many private ranches do not publish acreage figures, partly for privacy, partly because the numbers change as land is bought, sold, or leased. Attempts to reconcile these numbers run into methodological questions. Owned land is straightforward, but leased land varies. Short-term leases may not be counted consistently. Grazing rights on public land, if any remain, add another layer. Seasonal use of the Colorado property complicates state-by-state accounting. The lack of clarity is frustrating for anyone trying to understand the operation's current scale. It also reflects a broader reality. Land ownership in the American West is complex. Titles overlap. Leases shift. Boundaries are contested. Public records are incomplete. Even well-documented operations resist simple summary. For the JA, the lack of a definitive number is probably strategic. Publicity invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites questions about taxes, water use, grazing practices, and labor. Privacy protects flexibility. Ambiguity is a tool. What can be said with confidence is this: the operation is smaller than its peak, but larger than most ranches. It spans multiple properties in at least 2 states. It employs enough people to maintain working cattle operations year-round, and it continues under control of the same family line that has owned it for over a century. Whether that totals 158,500 acres or 335,000 acres or something else, the scale is significant. The exact number matters less than the pattern. Large-scale private landholding, maintained across generations, funded by accumulated capital, operating in ways that balance profit and preservation according to terms set by owners, not by public process or democratic input. The ranch is not unique in this. It is representative. Chapter 15. What Persists? The J.A. Ranch exists today as a working cattle operation, a national historic landmark, a family asset, and a symbol whose meaning depends on who is looking. For the family, it represents continuity, a legacy maintained across 5 generations, a connection to the frontier past that few families can claim. The operation provides income, but more importantly, it provides identity. The ranch is not just land, it is a name, a history, a claim on a particular version of the American story. For employees, it is a paycheck, work that is hard, seasonal, and not particularly well paid by modern standards. Some workers appreciate the connection to tradition, others see it as a job like any other. Few stay long enough to build the kind of multi-generational employment that once characterized ranch life. For historians and preservationists, the headquarters complex offers a tangible link to the 1870s cattle frontier. The buildings, many original or carefully restored, provide material evidence of how large-scale ranching operations functioned. The National Historic Landmark designation ensures some level of protection and public interest. For the general public, the ranch exists mostly as myth. The Goodnight legend, the frontier imagery, the idea of the Old West, preserved in working form. This version of the ranch is emotionally satisfying. It is also heavily edited. It foregrounds adventure and downplays extraction. It celebrates individual achievement and ignores structural advantage. It treats the past as quaint rather than contested. The question that hangs over the operation is whether what persists is the work or the story. The cattle are real. The grass is real. The fences require actual repair. But the interpretation of what it all means, why it matters, who deserves credit, those answers shift depending on perspective. Goodnight is remembered as a pioneer. The workers who built the fences are forgotten. The Adair Ritchie family is celebrated as stewards. The capital structure that gave them control is rarely examined. The ranch is praised as a success. The displacement that made it possible is mentioned briefly, if at all. The ambiguity is not accidental. It is essential to how the story is told and retold. Allowing multiple interpretations keeps the story alive. Settling on one version would force choices about what to emphasize and what to ignore. Ambiguity avoids those choices. What remains certain is that the canyon still holds grass and water. Cattle still graze. Someone still rides fences. The work continues because land and animals demand attention regardless of interpretation. The brand still marks hides and buildings. And somewhere in New York or Texas, descendants of John and Cornelia Adair still hold the majority share, just as the contract specified in 1877. The J.A. Ranch is not a relic. It is a working operation that carries history as both asset and burden. The past is invoked when useful. It is obscured when inconvenient. And the future, as always, depends on forces the operation can influence but never fully control. Markets, weather, regulation, family decisions, all these shape what comes next. The canyon will outlast the ranch. The grass will outlast the cattle. And the questions raised by what happened here, who paid, who profited, what was built, what was lost, those questions will outlast the answers anyone offers. The tension between what the ranch represents and what it actually does defines much of its modern existence. Tour groups visit the headquarters to see preserved buildings from the Goodnight era. They photograph stone walls, wooden beams, and artifacts displayed behind glass. The guides speak about frontier hardship, cattle drives, and the taming of wild land. The narrative is carefully curated. It emphasizes courage, innovation, and the triumph of human will over harsh conditions. What the tours rarely mention is the economic structure that made it all possible. Adair's capital, Goodnight's debt. The contract terms that ensured profit flowed to investors in Ireland and New York, while workers in the panhandle earned wages and nothing more. The preserved buildings are real. The context is selectively presented. This selective memory is not unique to the JA. It characterizes how the American West is remembered across the region. Ranches become heritage sites. Conflicts become adventures. Displacement becomes settlement. The language shifts to make the past more comfortable, more heroic, less morally complicated. Yet the complications remain, visible to anyone willing to look beyond the surface. The canyon that sheltered cattle once sheltered Comanche families. The grass that fed Goodnight's herds fed buffalo for centuries before cattle arrived. The water that made the operation viable was a resource controlled by force and law, not discovered or created by the men who claimed it. These facts do not erase the skill required to manage a large-scale ranching operation. They do not diminish the physical difficulty of the work. But they add context. They remind us that success is not just about individual effort. It is also about timing, access to capital, legal structures that favor certain forms of ownership, and historical circumstances that clear the ground for some while closing opportunities for others. The JA survives in part because it was large enough to weather hard times. Small operations failed. Farmers gave up. Neighboring ranches sold out. The JA contracted, but persisted. Size, built on Adair's capital and maintained through generations of inherited wealth, provided resilience that others could not match. This is not a story of superior skill. It is a story of resources deployed at scale over time. The modern cattle industry looks nothing like the 1880s frontier. Markets are global. Beef prices are influenced by trade agreements, currency fluctuations, and consumer trends. Technology has changed everything from breeding to feeding to slaughter. Yet the JA continues, adapting to each change while maintaining an identity rooted in the past. This raises a question that every historical operation faces. When does adaptation become transformation? At what point does continuity of name and ownership obscure fundamental changes in what the operation actually is? The JA today is not the JA of Goodnight's era. It cannot be. The economy, the technology, the labor force, the legal environment, all have changed beyond recognition. What persists is the claim, the assertion that this is the same enterprise, unbroken across nearly 150 years. That claim has value. It attracts visitors. It enhances the brand. It provides a marketing story that differentiates JA cattle from anonymous beef raised on industrial feedlots. Whether the claim is true depends on how you define continuity. If continuity means the same families control the land, then yes, it is continuous. If continuity means the same practices and relationships, then no, it has been transformed repeatedly. The workers who maintain the operation today do not live the lives of 1880s cowboys. They have trucks, cell phones, and access to modern veterinary care. They earn wages that must compete with other industries. They work in a legal environment with safety regulations, labor laws, and oversight that did not exist in Goodnight's time. The work is still hard. The conditions are still demanding. But it is not the same work. The cattle themselves have changed. Breeding programs have transformed the animals. Modern cattle gain weight faster, produce more tender beef, and handle feedlot conditions better than the longhorns Goodnight trailed into the canyon. The genetics are managed scientifically. The feeding is calculated for optimal return. This is industrial agriculture with a historical name, not frontier ranching preserved in amber. Yet the story the ranch tells emphasizes continuity over transformation. This is strategic. The value in the JA brand is not the efficiency of its operations. Many ranches are more efficient. The value is the story, the connection to the past, the idea that buying JA beef means participating in a tradition that stretches back to the frontier. This is marketing, and it works. Consumers pay premiums for heritage brands. Restaurants feature JA beef on menus to signal quality and authenticity. The history becomes a product, sold alongside the cattle. The irony is that the history being sold is a simplified version, edited for appeal. The full story, with its complications about capital structure, displacement, labor exploitation, and the gap between owners and workers, would not sell as well. So the simplified version persists. Goodnight the pioneer, Adair the visionary investor, the ranch as triumph, the challenges framed as natural obstacles overcome by determination. This version is not false, it is incomplete, and incompleteness is its own form of distortion. By omitting the parts of the story that are uncomfortable, the narrative implies they do not matter. But they do matter. They matter to descendants of the Comanche families who lost access to the canyon. They matter to descendants of the workers who built the fences and received wages, not ownership. They matter to anyone trying to understand how wealth accumulates and persists across generations. The JA Ranch did not create these patterns, it participated in them. It was one node in a larger network of capital, labor, and land that characterized the late 19th century American West. The patterns were legal. They were widely accepted at the time. They were also extractive, concentrating resources in the hands of a few, while many others worked for wages that kept them dependent. Modern ranching operates under different rules. Labor laws, environmental regulations, and market structures have all changed. But the fundamental pattern, capital controlling land and employing labor to work it, persists. The JA continues this pattern, adapted to the 21st century, but rooted in the same logic. Whether this pattern is sustainable long-term is an open question. Climate change threatens water availability. Drought cycles are expected to intensify. Beef consumption trends are shifting in some demographics. Competition from industrial agriculture increases. Property taxes rise. Operating costs climb. The next generation of the Adair Ritchie family will have to decide whether maintaining the ranch is worth the cost, both financial and personal. Some historical ranches have sold out. Others have converted to different uses, hunting leases, tourism, conservation easements that restrict cattle operations in favor of wildlife habitat. The JA has so far chosen to remain a working cattle operation, but that choice is remade every year, every generation. It is not guaranteed. The canyon itself remains relatively unchanged. The red walls still rise. The river still flows, though droughts make it shallower than it once ran. The grass still grows, though species composition has shifted with grazing pressure and changing climate patterns. The land is resilient, but not infinitely so. Every season of heavy grazing, every drought year, every decision about stocking rates and water use pushes against the limits of what the ecosystem can sustain. Sustainable ranching is possible. The question is whether the economic pressures that drive ranching decisions allow sustainability to be prioritized. When beef prices drop, the temptation is to stock more cattle to maintain revenue. When drought hits, the temptation is to graze harder while the grass is still there. These decisions make short-term sense. They risk long-term damage. The JA has survived this long in part by making decisions that balanced short-term needs with long-term sustainability. But those decisions were made by individuals, not by market forces. And as control passes across generations, there is no guarantee that future decision-makers will prioritize the same values. The conservation easements on the Colorado property provide some protection. They legally restrict what can be done with the land. But easements do not prevent overgrazing. They do not guarantee good management. They prevent development, which is valuable, but they do not ensure ecosystem health. The ultimate question the JA Ranch poses is this: what do we owe to the past, and what do we owe to the future? The past created the operation through displacement, capital concentration, and hard labor. The future will inherit whatever condition the land is in when the present generation finishes with it. The present, the moment we live in now, is where those obligations meet and conflict. The ranch cannot be neutral. Every decision favors some interest over another. Stocking rates favor profit over grass recovery. Fence placement favors cattle movement over wildlife corridors. Water use favors the operation over downstream users. These are not moral failures. They are the reality of operating a working ranch in a landscape where resources are finite and demands are many. What makes the JA notable is not that it avoids these conflicts. It is that it has managed them long enough to persist while others failed. That persistence is an achievement. It is also a responsibility. The longer an operation lasts, the more it shapes the land and the communities around it. The JA's decisions affect not just the cattle and the grass, but the entire ecosystem, the water table, the wildlife populations, the economic health of nearby towns. Whether the ranch accepts this responsibility explicitly or manages it by default through operational decisions, the impact is real. The canyon is not the same as it was when Goodnight arrived. It will not be the same when the next generation takes over. The question is whether the changes are intentional, managed with care and informed by ecological understanding, or whether they are the unintended consequences of decisions made for other reasons. The story the ranch tells about itself emphasizes stewardship. The actions the ranch takes are driven by economics. Sometimes those align, often they do not. When they conflict, economics usually wins. This is not cynicism, it is reality. Ranches that do not make money eventually fail. Families that cannot pay taxes lose land. The market does not care about historical significance. So the JA continues, threading a needle between preservation and profit, between history and adaptation, between the story it tells and the work it does. The thread is thin, the balance is precarious, and the outcome is not predetermined. The ranch might last another century, it might last another decade. The determining factors are outside the control of any single owner, manager, or worker. Markets shift. Climate changes, families make decisions, and the canyon, patient and indifferent, waits. The JA Ranch stands as testament to a particular moment in American history when capital, land, and labor aligned to create operations of extraordinary scale. The forces that made it possible, military displacement of indigenous peoples, British and American investment capital seeking returns, abundant open land available for claiming, the technology of barbed wire and windmills, cheap labor willing to work for wages in isolated conditions, all came together in the 1870s and 80s. Those forces have changed. Some disappeared entirely. Others evolved into new forms. But the ranch itself persists, carrying forward a name and an identity shaped by its origins while adapting to circumstances its founders could not have imagined. What that persistence means depends on who is asking. For some, it represents the enduring value of land, family continuity, and traditional practices in a rapidly changing world. For others, it represents the concentration of wealth and resources in private hands, maintained across generations through inheritance rather than merit. Both interpretations have evidence to support them. Both are partial truths. The full truth, if such a thing is possible to capture about any historical institution, lies somewhere in the accumulated details: the contracts signed, the wages paid, the grass grazed, the water used, the fences built and rebuilt, the cattle born, raised, and sold, the people who came, worked, and left, the ones who stayed, the decisions made year after year, generation after generation, that kept the operation running when others failed. The canyon holds all of this. The stone walls remember nothing and everything. They stood before humans arrived. They will stand long after the last fence rusts away. And in that persistence, they offer the only perspective that can contain the full complexity of what happened here: patient, indifferent, eternal.